Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the RotoPros pre-lock show, back for Monday to start the week, and we've got 9 games tonight. Pretty good slate, I think. The choices are solid ones, but there aren't so many that it's impossible to choose, especially a pitcher. I think it's pretty easy to have a narrow focus with the starting pitchers tonight. So for those of you who listen to the podcast, you probably already know what pitchers those are going to be. I'm pretty much still set on the same guys as yesterday. So there hasn't really been a change in terms of line movement or the starting lineups for Walker Buehler or for Jose Barrios. There's actually some positive line movement that favors both of them. The over-under is dropped in the Dodgers game. It's actually dropped even more significantly in the Twins game. That probably has a little bit to do with the Twins offense, which I'll get to when talking about offense. But no negative indicators whatsoever for Barrios or Buehler. I think they're still the two strongest values by a pretty decent amount. I'll mention Masahiro Tanaka because I think he has upside in that price range. I would say he would make sense if I thought he would have lower ownership than the other guys. But I don't really think that'll be the case. I think the Yankees are popular enough, both in terms of pitching and their hitters. Yankee players always have ownership. So I don't think it's some contrarian pick to pivot to Tanaka. I think ownership will be pretty spread out at pitching tonight with a lot of kind of big name pitchers. There are a bunch of decent choices. But Buehler and Barrios to me still seem like the two that are by far the best values. So those guys, I think, they fit together really well for most stacks. It's kind of just like that middle price range in the 8,000s and 9,000s where you can fit a lot of moderately priced hitters in with them. And there is a lot of value on moderately priced hitting tonight. But I do still think it makes sense to pay up for Gio Gonzalez in some lineups. He has a really easy matchup at home against the Padres. Just looking for their lineup because I didn't have that in front of me before. Still no Hunter Renfroe for the Padres. Still no Will Myers. But they actually do have a decent amount of right-handed bats in there tonight. They have Franmil Reyes, who I don't know too much about, but right-hand hitting prospect. Matt Caesar's leading off, so that's another righty. Freddie Galvis is a switch hitter, but he's actually a lot worse from the right side of the plate. So him and then I guess Eric Hosmer as a lefty. Those are the unfavorable sides of the plate for those two, but for everyone else, a bunch of right-handed batters. So that could be a little problematic for Gonzalez. The issue is just the Padres are just not very good at offense overall. Franchi Cordero has been one of their better hitters this year. He's not in the lineup tonight. So there's a little bit of, I don't know, both sides of the Padres lineup tonight. Maybe there's some good things about it, some bad things about it. The overall outlook for me on Gio Gonzalez kind of hasn't changed too much, even with this kind of fluid information. So I still think he's worth paying up for in some lineups. I still think he's a better play than Greinke. But I do think Greinke is worth having exposure to also because there is going to be salary left over with some of these offenses. And I don't feel that confident in Gio Gonzalez to want to have him like 50% or anything like that. So the breakdown I'm kind of thinking of is Buehler and Barrios maybe 80% each, and then maybe 20% each of Gonzalez and Greinke, or like a 30-10 split in favor of Gonzalez. But I think there's a case to be made for Greinke just being in some lineups. The Brewers strike out a lot. They still don't have Ryan Braun. They still don't have Eric Thames. It's not a great lineup overall, and Greinke is probably the best overall pitcher on the slate. So even though he's expensive, I think it's okay to use him, but he's clearly my 4th favorite guy. There really isn't anyone else I would use. I guess you could make a case for Bartolo Colon for leverage. The issue with taking a pitcher like Colon for leverage is that he doesn't get strikeouts. So I do like the idea of a pitcher against the Yankees because they should have by far the most ownership of any team tonight. But you need to see at least some upside in the opposition. And I guess Colon could throw a complete game shutout. He could get a lot of strikeouts, whatever. I mean, anyone can do anything on any given night. But Colon is just so unlikely to get a lot of strikeouts against the Yankees because he doesn't do that. So a best case realistic scenario for Colon is maybe he throws 6 or 7 shutout innings, but he probably is only able to do it with like 4 strikeouts. And even that is a very unlikely possibility. So the gamble on Colon, I guess, just isn't really worth it without the strikeout upside. And he's not quite cheap enough either where it's really that much more value than anyone else. I mean, if Cologne were literally min price, I probably would use him, even though there wouldn't be a ton of need to save the salary. But Buehler and Barrios are cheap enough where there's no reason to go cheaper than that at pitcher. So just thought I'd mention the potential leverage spot for Cologne because I do think he's really underrated as a pitcher, but still don't have any interest in him, even though I'm kind of low on the Yankees tonight overall. So that's probably it for pitcher. I think it's pretty straightforward. Offense is a little trickier, so I'll just jump right into that. A lot more to talk about with offense. So my two favorite spots tonight still are the St. Louis Cardinals and the Arizona Diamondbacks. I think for ownership, the Diamondbacks are a better play. I think the Cardinals have more expected output. They're a little more expensive. They'll probably have a bit higher ownership. I think the Cardinals could maybe be the third, maybe the second highest owned offense tonight. Although anything beyond the Yankees, it's probably not worth worrying too much about ownership. I think it'll be very spread around after the Yankee hitters. So the Cardinals get Ian Kennedy, who has been a little bit better this year, but he's been better as a real-life pitcher, and he's actually been more favorable to opponent fantasy points in the things that he's changed. So Kennedy has upped his strikeout rate a little bit, but he's lowered his ground ball rate. He's giving up a lot more fly balls this year and a lot more hard contact. Ian Kennedy always gives up hard contact, but he's giving up a lot of home runs, and his ground ball percentage is only around 30%. So there's definitely home run upside against him, probably as much as any pitcher going tonight. And I think Kennedy is just really bad overall. So the Cardinals are definitely cheaper than they should be. Tommy Pham at 4,600 is just too low of a price for how good he is and how good he is at scoring fantasy points. He's got the power. He steals bases. He scores fantasy points in a lot of ways. And he's probably as viable as any player in baseball at scoring fantasy points. So against Ian Kennedy, it's a really good matchup for him. And then everyone else on the Cardinals is really cheap. Marcell Ozuna has struggled this year. A lot of it, just looking at his batted ball data, it's really bad luck. I think Ozuna has kind of hit like an average hitter this year, as opposed to being a really good hitter last year. But his results has come out as something far worse than average because he's been unlucky while also slumping a bit. Going forward, I think Ozuna will be fine. The production he had last year might have been unsustainable, but he should be above average for the rest of the season. And he's priced all the way down to 3,300 in a really easy matchup. Matt Carpenter is 3,400. Tyler O'Neill batting fifth is at 3,600. I definitely like him less than Carpenter and Ozuna, but he's a prospect who's always had power throughout the minors. He's a pretty good prospect, and he's hit 2 home runs, I think, over his first 3 games or so. So he's done well to start his, I think he played last year a little bit, but O'Neill has been good in the majors this year in a very limited sample. He's fine to include in game stacks. I'm definitely missing another Cardinals player here. Who else is in the middle of their lineup? Jed Jorko batting 6th. Let me just see who I'm forgetting here. Ozuna, Carpenter, Pham, O'Neill. Oh, and Jose Martinez too. He's priced up to 4,100, so I don't like him as much. But for game stacks, I think Martinez is also fine. So the Cardinals just have an easy matchup against a homer-prone bad pitcher. Kennedy is probably worse than Bartolo Colon, but the way that he's going to give up runs is definitely more inclined to be via home runs. The issue for the Cardinals compared to the Yankees is they're just less good offensively, and also it's less of a hitter's park. But they're cheap enough where I think there's way more value on St. Louis. And then with Arizona, they get the matchup against Chase Anderson, who is dramatically overrated by his peripherals by his ERA this year compared to his peripherals. So 3.97 ERA for Anderson, but his FIP and xFIP are around 6, and he's not getting the strikeouts this year. He's not getting swing and misses. His K rate is at 6 per 9 innings. He missed his last start because he was sick. I think there's a lot of reason to think there's something wrong with Chase Anderson just because he's been so much worse than last year. But even without that, Anderson was just kind of below average for most of his career until last year when he all of a sudden had all of this success. And I think we can kind of throw last year out the window after seeing what he's done so far this year and how he's kind of just reverted back to what he was previously. The line movement for this game is also fairly telling for the Diamondbacks-Brewers game. So initially, the over-under of 8 actually jumped up to 8.5, despite almost everyone betting on the under. And since that time, the over-under has fallen pretty dramatically. It's now at 8 and trending down towards 7.5. But it's coincided with a line movement towards the Diamondback side pretty heavily. So they've gone from -110 to -130. So I think what happened was we saw an initial boost to the expected run outputs for both teams, and now we've seen a decrease to the implied run total for just the Milwaukee side. So that initial boost we saw for Arizona, that remains unchanged. So I think sharper bettors who initially were on Arizona's offense, I think that there's no reason to doubt that. But what we've seen here in the line movement, I think, is a boost for Zach Greinke, which is part of the reason I mentioned being slightly more interested in him just a few minutes ago. So Arizona's offense looks to be in a great spot. Hitters park in Milwaukee. Like we mentioned last night, Josh Hader should be unavailable tonight. The Brewers' bullpen is good on the back end for protecting leads. And they have Corey Knebel back, too, their closer, before he got hurt and before Hader took over. But the rest of the Brewers' relievers for games where they're losing, not really an impressive group. So Arizona definitely has upside here. They have Jake Lamb back, which is a pretty big boost. And they're also just really, really cheap. So we've got David Peralta's priced down at $3,400. Paul Goldschmidt is at $4,200, which is close to as cheap as he's been. Jake Lamb, who crushes righties, is at $4,200. Definitely a good spot for him. And then the 2 and 5 hitters are Chris Owings and Ketel Marte, who are both priced below $3,000. And Gerard Dyson, batting 6th, is at $2,900. Nick Ahmed, $3,100. Jeff Mathis, $2,300. It's just a very, very cheap lineup. I probably would want to stick to Peralta, Lamb, and Goldschmidt the most. But full stacks here are certainly in play because of how cheap the prices are. And I think in terms of being contrarian, of all the offenses in good spots tonight, I think the Diamondbacks will have the least ownership of those teams because I think Chase Anderson still has the perception of being a good starting pitcher. He has a 3.97 ERA, which is, I guess, the first number that people will look at. So I don't really think too many people will be on the Diamondbacks tonight. And I think in a hitter's park in Milwaukee, it's a really strong spot for them given their prices. So weighing them versus the Cardinals for the number 1 offense, I don't really think it's even necessary to do it because I'm totally fine just playing half exposure to the Diamondbacks, half of the exposure to the Cardinals, and just having those 2 offenses as the primary focuses for stacks. I don't really have a ton of interest in stacking anyone else too heavily, although I am going to run through some other teams that definitely have good plugs, and I guess why I don't really want to stack them. But it still seems clear to me that the Cardinals and the Diamondbacks for tournaments tonight are the 2 best teams to stack. So I guess I'll mention the Yankees next because everyone is going to want to know about the Yankees tonight against Bartolo Colon. Colon is definitely less bad of a pitcher than what we framed him as last year and what most people think of him. Because if you look at Colon over the last 4 or 5 years, he's actually been pretty solid every year except for last year. And seeing him get worse last year, I mean, it would make sense if you just knew that information alone. He turned 43 years old last year. You would expect at some point he's going to fall off and become worse. But his velocity wasn't down or anything. He just had a bad season last year. He just threw less strikes, couldn't get as many swing and misses. For whatever reason last year, he was just worse as a pitcher. But in 2016, he had a 3.43 ERA with pretty good peripherals, 4.16 the year before that, 4.09 the year before that. So Colon has been solid. It's not like he's perennially awful. He just had a really bad season last year. This year, Colon is walking less hitters than he ever has. He has a 2.82 ERA, 4.47 FIP, and 3.73 xFIP. 3.86 SIERA is the other one we sometimes will mention. But Colon has been above average overall this year. And now that we have this data point of Colon being decent this year, it makes it easier to overlook what he did last year and how bad he was. So if you take like a 5-year average of what Colon's been since he kind of got older and lost some of the zip on his fastball, maybe that turning point was around 2014 or so, his last really good season. Since that point, he's just kind of been average every year. And I think we can still assume that Colon is average. So the idea that the Yankees are facing one of the worst pitchers in baseball, I think it's a pretty false premise. And the Yankees are really expensive. So I'm okay with plugging them like wherever they fit. but I don't want to go out of my way to stack them because I think it's a little bit of an overvalued spot, especially given the potential ownership. There are some Yankee hitters that are cheap enough where there is value on them, and I certainly am not advocating fading the Yankees, but I think using them as plugs, which would limit the exposure to them relative to the field, I think that's the way to go. Didi Gregorius specifically is really cheap at 3,900, so I think he's a really good play tonight. But 4,800 for Gary Sanchez, and then Judge and Stanton are in the 5,000s. I kind of just want to be even with the field on those guys, maybe get them into like 20 to 30% of lineups. Didi, I think, could make sense to have a bit more than that. And then looking at the rest of the Yankee lineup here, I think their lineup's out. Gardner's up to 4,100. He was cheaper than that for a while, so I don't have too much interest in him. I think Hicks, Austin, Walker, Gleyber Torres. Not really Torres. He's up to 4,300, but I think Hicks, Austin, and Walker are just kind of okay plays. I probably wouldn't have too much of them. But as for the core of the Yankees, I really don't think it's that strong of a spot for them given their prices. And Colon is a better pitcher than actually a lot of guys that are pitching tonight. I think Colon is substantially better than Ian Kennedy. I think he's better than Chase Anderson. I think he's better than Andrew Kashner or Hector Santiago, which I'll get to next. He's probably better than Blaine Hardy. He's probably better than Jason Vargas or Eliezer Hernandez. So Colon actually might be in the top half of pitching for just ability of the guys going tonight, which seems kind of weird to say. But he really has not had a bad recent track record aside from last season. So, yeah, the Yankees are okay just because of how good they are, and it's kind of a plus matchup because of the park in Texas. But this isn't some unbelievable can't-miss spot for them. I think it's pretty standard considering the Yankees always have a lot of upside because they're just really, really good at hitting. So, yeah, Yankees as plugs, I think that's the way to go around Cardinals and Diamondbacks stacks. The White Sox-Orioles game is potentially really interesting, but there has been some troubling line movement here. The over-under opened at 9.5. It's down to almost 9, despite most people betting the over at 70% or so. It's not great hitting weather in Chicago tonight. Temperatures in the 50s. These offenses just also are not that good. Like, I think Santiago is really bad. Kashner is below average, but maybe not quite that terrible. Kind of similar to Colon, where he was uncharacteristically awful last year, and he generally has peripherals that would have him in the mid-4s for his ERA. So Kashner is probably just a little bit below average, not close to one of the worst pitchers in baseball or anything. But I still think the White Sox are in a good spot against him. The Orioles are in a good spot against Santiago, but I just don't think it compares to these other offenses that are a lot cheaper. The Orioles specifically are very expensive, and especially Manny Machado at 5,600. That's kind of just a lot to pay for anyone. And the other issue with the Orioles is that Hector Santiago has really pronounced reverse splits where he's better against right-handed batters. And the Orioles' entire lineup is right-handed batting. For the most part, Chris Davis is left-handed, but everyone else in there is a righty. So, I don't know. It's kind of just a spot that I think misses the cut. I think there's upside. I wouldn't be surprised if the Orioles had a huge game against Santiago. But given the value across the board, I don't think the Orioles are as good of a play as some other teams. If they fit for plugs, I think they're fine. I think it makes sense to pay up for Manny Machado if you have the leftover money, but I'm certainly not going out of my way to target him. And then for the White Sox side, they're also just not that good offensively. And I think Kashner is good enough that there's not some crazy amount of upside against him. But the high-end guys on the White Sox, they're better hitters, I think, are worth using. So if Moncada fits, I think he's worth having. But for Jose Abreu, I'd rather use Jose Martinez and Paul Goldschmidt for cheaper. I think they're in better matchups, and they're pretty comparable hitters, all three of those guys. So Abreu's probably a fade. But I think Moncada's fine. I think Daniel Palka is a decent value betting 4th. Wellington Castillo at catcher is down to 7th in the order, so that kind of has me off him, although if he fits, I guess he's an okay play. But that's probably all I have for the Orioles-White Sox game. I think there are a few guys that are worth plugging in, but nothing too much to look at here. I think it's kind of the same goes for the Marlins-Mets game, where there's some pricing value here, but The offenses just really aren't very good, so I don't really like that game too much. And the Marlins have actually gotten a bit more expensive. JT Realmuto is at 4,000. That's kind of high for him. Castro and Brian Anderson are still cheap, so I think they're good plays. Justin Bour against the lefty, I'm not totally sure if I want to go there. Martin Prado, though, is probably a good value play at 2,700 if you need the savings. I don't think we will for this kind of slate, though. And then, yeah, I think the Mets are in an okay spot, but that's kind of fringy, I think. Hernandez is probably bad, but the Mets just are not that good offensively. So if they fit, fine, but I don't really have too much interest in the Mets. All right, what else do we have? I think it should be probably a pitcher's duel in the Phillies-Braves game, but I think both of those pitchers are too expensive to really warrant paying up for. So I think that game is probably just a fade. Basically, the situation there is that the offenses are priced up and the pitchers are priced up, so there just isn't value on either side. The other interesting offense that I'll mention before wrapping this up is the Twins against Blaine Hardy. So Brian Dozier has just been awful this year. He's not making any hard contact, so it's kind of like the opposite of what's going on with Marcell Ozuna, where he struggled, but Ozuna has actually clearly been unlucky based on his hard hit rate, line drive rate, all the things that go into expected stats. Ozuna has clearly been unlucky. That's not the case for Dozier. He's just not hitting the ball well. So I don't really have much interest in Dozier, even though he is kind of a good value for his price, just relative to what his cost has been throughout the season, what it usually is. 3,900 is low for Dozier against the lefty, but the other issue is that this is probably going to be a bullpen game for the Tigers. So with right-handed pitchers coming in, that kind of takes away from Dozier a little bit. But I still think some of these Twins guys are worth having. I think Escobar with the two positions, third and short at 3,700 is fine, although I prefer Didi. You can get Escobar at lower ownership, though, so it depends how contrarian you want to get there. I think Max Kepler is a good play at 3,400. I think Rosario is a good enough hitter at 4,000 that he's worth using, but I kind of just have mild interest in the Twins. I think including them as kind of like mini stacks as a supplement to the Cardinals or the Diamondbacks, I think that's where I would use the Twins. I don't really like them elsewhere. So I think that's going to wrap it up, unless anyone has questions. I'll throw out one more team that I would maybe stack in one lineup. I don't think anyone's going to use the Texas Rangers tonight, and Tanaka can certainly be homer prone at times. Also a strong hitting environment there in Texas tonight, and I think that should be, I won't say the lowest owned offense of the night, but pretty close. And of the offenses that should have basically no ownership, those would probably include the Padres, the Rockies. I think the Rangers have the most upside of those teams. Joey Gallo can hit 2 or 3 home runs in a night against anybody at any point. So I don't know. I'd want to have him at least a little bit on a night where no one's going to use him. But yeah, I don't have much interest in the Rangers overall. They're just better spots. But if you want to be especially contrarian, I think the Rangers are an okay team to stack. So that's going to do it. Should be back tomorrow. Good luck, everyone, for tonight. Just quickly looking again to see if anyone else anything need to talk about. But I think that's it. All right, so see everyone tomorrow.